If you say, well, science hasn't found it yet. Science hasn't found any evidence for the existence of God. Well, is science interested in the question to begin with? Science is not prepared to ask this question. Science looks for where it lost the ring under the street light because that's the only place that it has any light. There's a number of things that science doesn't know. If you read some literature, I enjoy popular science literature, and I read such books and magazines. Among the questions that science doesn't know is, for example, some very basic questions. How does a candle work? Nobody knows. There are literally tens of thousands of chemical reactions involved in how does alcohol work on the brain exactly? Nobody knows exactly. No one can explain the exact mechanism by how it works. Why does a shower curtain, when you're in the shower, tend to glide over towards the stream of water that's coming down? Nobody knows this either. What gives matter its most basic property, mass, as we mentioned? Nobody knows this. The scientists don't know this. And how does gravity work? They don't know this either. Taxonomy, is the classification of plants and animals. About at a optimistic estimate, between 5 and 10% of the life forms on the planet have been named, i.e. discovered. We don't know most of the things that are on even the planet Earth. And so why this tremendous epistemological optimism, if not hubris, it's more like arrogance, that science has discovered everything and that what science has not discovered doesn't exist. The shower curtain obviously exists despite the scientists and these other things. And so this is an unreasonable demand or it's an unreasonable premise. It's just what science hasn't discovered isn't worth knowing. The Big Bang, before which there was nothing. They said, well, there was a few things that were before it, but what was before them? Things are. If it was contingent, then did things have an origin, and from whence did they come? These things are not, so they're not cut and dried things. So it turns out about 85, or about much of the biomass on the planet. I believe it's about 85% of the biomass on the planet. In other words, if you piled all the plants and animals on top of each other, on the face of the earth, and is in fact microorganisms that exist under the surface of the earth. Some of them extremely far down. Some of them don't breathe oxygen. Some of them are not carbon-based organisms. They're boron-based organisms. Some survive on hydrogen. They don't breathe oxygen at all. Completely weird life forms that nobody had. And if you took all of these out of the earth, according to the present presumption about how many of them there are, they would equal a pile of organic matter that was about 5 feet tall, spread over all of the Earth's surface. It's a huge amount of it. No one even had the faintest clue that they existed before the 1980s. And so the presumption that science is the default knowledge, and that what science hasn't discovered there's no presumption for it to exist, it's not borne out by the history of scientific discovery. And so why should we presume it? And so this is one point about faith and about all I accept is the facts. Well, what are the facts? And how come you walk into buildings? How come if you hear a piece of information from 3 people on the street, if you heard 3 people say at different parts of the town, for example, the vice president has been shot, you would believe it. You heard it from this person, you heard it from another person, you hear it from the 3rd person. It's finished. It's a fact as far as you're concerned. Yeah. So similarly, there are influential interpretations of the way that the world works, and they change. Science changes. New discoveries will be revising, probably fairly radically, our conception of the cosmos. So religion is also an explanation of why things happen. It's a teleological explanation. It doesn't go from one cause and then the other thing is caused out of it, and therefore it caused the third thing, which begs the question as to the origin of things. Where did it begin? Where did it begin? And so why should the most interesting event of all, if you take a purely scientific causative explanation of things, why should the most interesting event of all, the Big Bang or its father, have no causal explanation at all? The big exception. And if it doesn't, if it does have a cause, there's a regress there. So we have to explain it. And if it doesn't have a cause, then why should it be the exception to the rule that you've made that everything has to have a cause to explain it? Whereas the religion explains things in terms of they exist because they point towards some goal, they point towards something. The Martin Rees, the astronomer royal in Cambridge, has written his book, just 6 numbers, in which he establishes that there are certain ratios, the ratios of hydrogen, the squares, these basic relations of matter. There are 6 ratios that exist, that if they didn't exist, the universe could not exist, could not be as we know it, could not exist at all, as a matter of fact. And the chances of these 6 numbers coming about in confluence together is impossibly remote. As one person, another physicist, expressed it, says the possibility of the world assembling itself, that these 6 numbers should come together in exactly these ratios, is about like the possibility of a tornado hitting a junkyard and assembling a Boeing 747. I mean, things show us a fantastic complexity and a fantastic design, and a design argues for a designer. The origin of life, we've talked about this before, and the origin of life, the nutrient soup theory, that the surface of the planet just cooked up, the amino acids, and they assembled themselves into life. It's in the history of cytology, of these knowledge, human knowledge about how cells work, this was possible to believe before the discovery of the electron microscope. But in light of what we know today, the simplest cell that exists looks about as simple as New York City. It has tens of thousands of parts. And so, what are the chances of such an entity assembling itself? No, not just assembling itself and having also a reproductive system that would be able to produce another exactly like it. It doesn't sound very feasible on the basis of what we see around us. If you see, a novel like War and Peace, you say, well, yes, it's conceivable that a typewriter, it could have fallen down a staircase and, written a word, and produced something like. But, when you see a novel like War and Peace, you say, well, there must be a Tolstoy behind it somewhere. And similarly, in the natural world, the origin of life argues for something above it. There's a level of complexity that doesn't look like it could have assembled itself from less complex entities. It doesn't look like it at all. Rather, it looks like it was organized by something, and this is what we see, this is what our experience attests to in everything. When you see a fan, we say, well, there's got to be a factory somewhere that produced the fan. Something simpler than the fan didn't produce it. We see anything complex, we assume that something more complex produced it. We see a work of genius. We see, if one studies parasitology, the fantastically complex relations that different life forms have, synergistic or parasitical relationships that they have, how they benefit from each other. The life cycle of certain microorganisms that are parasitical. One, for example, that I read of, it infects. The life cycle, it has to have these stages that it goes through in order for it to reproduce. It begins in the belly of a snail, and it affects the eyes of the snail, and so it brings about a blindness. And so the snail goes up on top of a leaf and looking around, trying to find the light, because this is what it was to want to do before the blindness assailed it. At which point, a certain species of bird must see the snail there, its bloodshot eyes, and go down and eat it, and carry the microorganism elsewhere and drop it. These are all. It has to infect the snail. The snail has to go up. It has to be eaten by a certain bird, and has to be carried over. And no matter how much you think, for many of the life cycles of parasitical animals, there's no way that you could cook up how the first time happened. It just doesn't work. And so these are some difficulties for the nutrient soup, cooking up these, the complex comes from something more complex. It's organized by something. If you see a work of genius, a work of artistry, then it comes from, and this is what we say, that had a designer. The design had a designer, and so it's not a. So there are many people a great deal smarter than me and a great deal smarter than you that have believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the belief in a supreme being is not irrational, and it's not absurd, and it's not illogical, and it's not unscientific. Scientific knowledge produces technically exploitable knowledge based on empirical data, that it finds in front of it. And faith is found in everything, all walks of our life, every place that we see faith. We go into a building on faith. We eat food at the supermarket on faith. We buy something from the butcher and eat it on faith. And sometimes it proves well-founded, sometimes it proves ill-founded. All of these things. We don't ask for proof. We don't say, has this particular piece of meat been analyzed, sent to a lab to prove that it doesn't contain salmonella. Rather, we infer that because why all of these things? Because it's useful to walk into buildings, it's useful to be able to buy a piece of meat and eat it without sending it to the lab first. It's useful to be able to trust other people when they inform something that some piece of news, some fact has happened in the world. All of these things. Similarly, religion has proved its value because it solves people's problems. It's effective, and it covers it's a wider explanation, and its horizons are broader than any other kind of explanation. That's why it's the most powerful force for humanity, for collective human action that's ever been known and ever been ever been seen. And so, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also is something that many people arrive at without having it suggested to them. They find an urge to worship the Supreme Being within themselves.